The desert had a way of stripping a man bare, down to bone, down to truth. Eli Turner knew that better than anyone. His ranch sat on a lonely stretch of Arizona land, where the earth cracked under a merciless sun and the wind carried nothing but dust. He had inherited the place from his father, who had died years back, leaving Eli with little more than a weather-beaten shack, half-wild cattle, and a name no one cared about. Ranching wasn't kindness. It was survival, and Eli had grown hard trying to wrestle life out of a land that seemed determined to kill him. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Eli saddled his old Mustang and rode the ridge above the canyon. He was hunting strays, 2 calves that had wandered too far, and his eyes scanned the land, sharp but weary. The desert stretched in every direction, an ocean of scrub and rock punctuated by the bones of dead trees. It was quiet. Too quiet, he thought, until a sound broke through the silence. At first it was faint, almost like the cry of a bird carried by the wind. But no, this was different. A voice strained, a human sound. Eli slowed his horse, listening harder. Another cry reached him, low and muffled, echoing out of the ravine below. Instinct told him to ride on. Trouble wasn't his business, not in these parts. Outlaws hid in gullies, and sometimes the cries you followed led only to ambush. But something in the sound, desperation raw and real, cut through his caution. With a grunt, Eli turned his horse and started down the slope, careful on the loose rock. The ravine was narrow, carved by years of flash floods. He followed the sound deeper until he rounded a bend and saw what stopped his breath cold. There, beneath a fallen ledge of stone, 2 figures were trapped. At first he thought they were ordinary women, maybe settlers, but as he got closer his eyes widened. They were huge. Each one must have stood nearly 7 feet tall, built with a strength that dwarfed any man he'd ever seen. Their dark hair spilled across the rock, and their eyes, fierce yet pained, locked on him the moment he appeared. The boulder that had pinned them was massive, half the size of a wagon, weighing more than any single man could dream of moving. Their legs were caught beneath it, blood seeping into the dirt. They had clearly been struggling for hours, their skin bruised, their breaths ragged. One of them raised her head and spoke in broken English, her voice a thunderous whisper. "Help us." Eli sat frozen for a moment. He had heard stories told in saloons, half-whispered legends of Apache giants, warriors born from the old blood of mountains themselves. No white man he knew had ever claimed to see them up close. And yet here they were, flesh, blood, and dying before his eyes. Every sensible thought told Eli to back away, to ride home and forget this. Helping them might mean war with their people. Leaving them might mean their deaths. But when he looked into their eyes, wide with both fear and defiance, something in him stirred, a memory of his father's voice. A man's worth is measured not by the coin in his pocket, but by what he does when no one's watching. He swallowed hard, dismounted, and approached. "All right," he muttered, mostly to himself. "Let's see what we can do." The women watched him closely as he dropped his saddlebag and began rummaging for rope and tools. He found a length of hemp, frayed but sturdy, and a rusty iron bar he used for fence work. The rock was too heavy to lift outright. He'd need leverage. Sweat already prickled his brow, though the sun was sinking. Eli jammed the iron bar beneath the boulder, wedging it against another stone, and threw his weight on it. The rock shifted, barely an inch, but enough to draw a gasp from the trapped sisters. Encouraged, Eli tied the rope around a nearby mesquite tree and looped it around the boulder. He pulled until his arms shook, then pulled again, gritting his teeth as pain flared through his back. The stone groaned but would not budge enough. He stopped to catch his breath, chest heaving, hands raw. The sisters exchanged words in their own tongue, voices deep and musical, before one of them spoke again in English. "You small man. Why help?" Eli spat into the dust, wiped his brow, and shrugged. "Ain't right leaving anyone to die out here. Doesn't matter who you are." For the first time, a flicker of surprise crossed their faces. He worked through the night. When the moon climbed high and cast silver across the desert, Eli tried again and again. He used rocks to build a base under the bar, gaining more leverage. He poured every ounce of strength he had into prying that boulder up. His muscles screamed, his palms split open, but inch by inch the stone began to rise. "Now," he shouted, voice hoarse. The sisters pushed with what little strength remained in them, dragging their legs free as the rock shifted just enough. Eli dropped the bar and stumbled back as the boulder crashed into place again, shaking the ground. The women were free. Eli knelt beside them, heart pounding. Their legs were bruised, torn, but not broken beyond healing. He tore strips of cloth from his own shirt, binding their wounds as best he could. The women, though giant in size, were silent with exhaustion, their breaths shallow but steady. When he was done, he sat back on his heels, staring at them in the pale light. They were unlike anything he had ever known, beings caught between myth and flesh. One of them opened her eyes and fixed him with a steady gaze. "You saved us," she said, her voice low but clear. Why? Eli thought for a moment. He could have lied, could have said he expected payment or feared their vengeance. But the truth slipped out before he could stop it. Because no one else was here. And if I was down there, I'd pray someone would do the same. A silence stretched, broken only by the whisper of desert wind. Then both sisters nodded slowly, as if weighing his words against something far older than him. The stronger of the two pushed herself up on one elbow, towering even in her weakened state. She reached out, her hand massive enough to engulf his, and pressed her palm gently against his chest. "We remember," she said. "Our people will not forget this, rancher." Before he could speak, they rose shakily, leaning on each other. Despite their wounds, they walked away into the shadows of the ravine, their towering forms swallowed by the desert night. Eli sat there long after they had gone, staring into the dark, wondering if he had just doomed himself or saved himself, or both. By the time he returned to his ranch, dawn was breaking over the horizon. The cattle lowed in the distance, the earth smelled of dust and blood, and Eli felt as though the world had shifted in some quiet, irreversible way. He tried to shake it off, to convince himself it had been a fever dream born of exhaustion. But the torn sleeves on his shirt, the raw blisters on his hands, and the echo of those giant footsteps told him it had been real. And deep inside, he knew. Nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The morning broke with a strange stillness, the kind that made Eli Turner's skin prickle. He rose from his cot with his muscles sore and his hands raw, the memory of the night still fresh in his bones. He had dreamed of the sisters, giant figures looming against the moon, their eyes burning with something that was not quite human, not quite mortal. Eli had seen many things in the desert, coyotes tearing at calves, storms swallowing whole canyons, but never anything like that. He tried to shove the memory aside, telling himself he was a tired fool chasing shadows. But when he stepped outside, the air carried a weight he could not explain. The land stretched flat and endless, the morning sun gilding the dust in dull gold. His cattle grazed half-heartedly, bones showing through their hides. He should have been thinking about water lines, fences, and feed. He should have been thinking about debts and the banker in town who was circling his ranch like a buzzard. Instead, all Eli could think of was the echo of the words the giant sisters had spoken. "Our people will not forget this, rancher." He didn't know if those words promised reward or danger. Either way, they stayed in his head like a splinter. By mid-morning, Eli had saddled his horse and was checking the fence line when he saw it. A thin ribbon of dust rising on the horizon. At first, he figured it was just a herd of cattle being driven across the desert, or maybe settlers moving their wagons. But this dust was too steady, too compact, like a storm brewing low and fast. Eli shaded his eyes, squinting into the sun. Then he saw them, riders, dozens of them. Horses painted with streaks of white clay, feathers whipping in the wind, spears glinting under the light. His throat went dry. It was a war party. Eli felt his pulse quicken as he turned his horse back toward the ranch. He reached the yard just as the first riders came into full view, their silhouettes cutting across the desert like a wave of steel and color. He dropped from his saddle and grabbed his rifle, leaning against the porch post as the thunder of hooves grew louder. Dust swallowed everything, and then silence. The riders fanned out in a wide circle around his ranch, eyes burning with suspicion, spears held upright, ready. Their horses snorted, hooves pawing at the ground. Eli tightened his grip on the rifle. One wrong move and he knew he'd be skewered before he could fire a shot. Then the circle parted, and a single rider emerged. He was taller than the rest. His horse draped in furs and beads that shimmered in the sunlight. His head was crowned with eagle feathers that streamed down his back, and his face was painted in bold lines of red and black. His eyes, sharp as obsidian, locked on Eli as though they could cut him open. Even without an introduction, Eli knew this was no ordinary warrior. This was the chief. The chief dismounted slowly, each motion deliberate as though reminding Eli that this was not a raid or a robbery, but a matter of judgment. The earth seemed to still beneath his boots as he stepped forward, and his warriors remained silent, watching. Eli's heart thudded in his chest. He had heard stories about Apache chiefs, about their cunning, their ferocity, their unbending pride. He had heard white settlers spit their names like curses in saloons. Yet as the man approached, Eli felt not hatred but something heavier. Like standing before a storm, he could neither fight nor flee. The chief stopped a few feet away, his shadow long across the dust. For a moment neither man spoke. Then the chief broke the silence with a voice that was deep, steady, and commanding. "My daughters," he said. Eli blinked, his mouth going dry. The chief's gaze sharpened. "They came to me last night. They told me of a man in the desert, a rancher, who moved mountains to save them. My daughters, who were born from the old blood of giants, walk again because of you." Eli opened his mouth, closed it again. He didn't know what words could possibly fit. His rifle felt heavy in his hands, but he let it fall, barrel first, into the dust. He stood straighter, swallowing the lump in his throat. I did what anyone would have done," he managed. The chief's eyes narrowed slightly as though testing the truth of those words. "No," he said after a pause. "Most men would not. Most men fear what they do not know. You saw two beings larger than life, not of your people, and still you gave your strength until your body broke. That is not the way of most men." The warriors murmured softly among themselves, but none interrupted. Eli felt their eyes crawling across him, weighing whether he was coward or fool, hero or thief. The chief's voice cut through again, sharper now. "Do you know what you have done, rancher? Do you understand the choice you made?" Eli swallowed hard, his throat dry as the dust around him. "I don't claim to understand much. I just saw two people dying. Didn't seem right to leave them there." For a long time the chief said nothing. The silence was heavy, suffocating. Then slowly he raised his hand and the warriors lowered their spears. The tension broke, though Eli's chest still felt bound tight. The chief stepped closer until his eyes were level with Eli's. They were dark, but not cruel. Eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. "My daughters live because of you. That makes you a man bound to us now. In our way, debts such as these cannot be ignored." Eli felt a strange shiver crawl down his spine. The weight of those words was not a promise alone, it was a judgment. The chief was not thanking him. He was deciding his fate. The chief gestured, and from the circle 2 riders moved forward. Between them, walking with slow, powerful strides, came the sisters. Eli's breath caught at the sight of them again in daylight. Even wounded, they were towering, their shadows falling across the ground like twin sentinels. Their dark eyes found him immediately, and though they said nothing, the faintest flicker of recognition passed between them, a memory of the night's struggle and survival. The chief looked between his daughters and the rancher. "They spoke of you with respect," he said, "but I must see with my own eyes whether such respect is earned." Eli's stomach twisted. He didn't know what kind of trial the chief meant, whether it was a test of strength, of courage, or of loyalty. Whatever it was, he knew the eyes of an entire people were on him now, and his next words, his next action, would decide more than just his own fate. He opened his mouth, unsure of what would come out, but before he could speak, the chief raised one hand, silencing the moment. "We came not to take," the chief said slowly, voice carrying across the circle of warriors, "but to give. But what we give will depend on you, Eli Turner. You are a poor man in the eyes of your people, but to mine, that is yet to be decided." The word struck Eli like a hammer. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming to run, yet his feet stayed planted in the dust. The sisters, silent as mountains, stood behind their father, their gaze never leaving him. The desert wind stirred between them, carrying with it the weight of a decision that would change everything. And Eli realized with a chill that whatever the chief had come to say, it was not just gratitude. It was something much larger, something that could lift him higher than he had ever dreamed or crush him lower than he had ever feared. The desert air was heavy, as though every grain of dust carried the weight of what was about to be decided. Eli Turner stood in the yard of his worn-out ranch, staring into the sharp, unreadable eyes of the Apache chief. The circle of warriors had tightened around him, their silence more threatening than raised weapons. The 2 giant sisters lingered behind their father, their immense forms casting long shadows across the cracked earth. Eli felt like a man caught between two worlds, too small to matter, yet somehow the center of everything. The chief finally moved. He stepped closer, his gaze never wavering. "Few men would risk their life for strangers," he said, his deep voice rolling like thunder. "Fewer still for daughters of a people you do not belong to." Eli's throat was dry, but he forced his words out. "Didn't see strangers," he said. "I saw folks who needed help." It sounded simple when he said it, too simple. But it was the truth. The chief studied him for a long moment. Then, with a slow gesture of his hand, the ring of warriors eased back. They were still watchful, but the tension shifted, less like a blade at Eli's throat and more like a test of patience. "You are poor," the chief said, his voice steady but sharp. "This land you cling to barely feeds your animals. The men in your town look at you as if you are already buried. Yet you chose to spend your strength on my daughters, knowing it might cost you your life." "Why?" Eli swallowed hard. He could have lied. He could have claimed he sought favor, or honor, or some kind of reward. But the chief's eyes seemed to cut through every false word before it was even spoken. Eli took a breath and told the truth. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said quietly. "A man doesn't walk away from someone trapped like that. Not if he's got a shred of decency left." The chief's expression shifted just slightly, as though some unseen scale had tipped. He turned his head and spoke a few words in his own tongue. The sisters responded in deep, rolling syllables, their voices strong despite the bruises still visible on their limbs. When they finished, the chief looked back at Eli. "My daughters say you fought the mountain itself to free them," he said. "They say you bled with your hands until the stone moved. You could have walked away and none would have blamed you. But you stayed." Eli had no answer. His hands still bore the raw cuts and blisters from that night. He flexed his fingers unconsciously, feeling the sting. The chief raised his hand and one of the warriors stepped forward, carrying a bundle wrapped in deerskin. He laid it carefully at the chief's feet. The chief unwrapped it slowly, revealing a set of weapons, an obsidian-tipped spear, a bow strung with sinew, and a knife with a bone handle carved in intricate patterns. The weapons shimmered faintly in the sunlight, the kind of tools no ordinary man could claim. "These are the tools of my people," the chief said. "They are not given lightly. A man who carries them carries our trust, our protection, and our judgment. They are gifts, but also chains. Do you understand?" Eli hesitated, staring at the weapons. They were beautiful, fierce, and sacred in a way he couldn't fully comprehend. To accept them felt dangerous, but refusing them felt worse. He nodded slowly. "I understand." The chief's gaze softened just enough to show that the words mattered. He motioned again, and the giant sisters stepped forward. They placed bundles at Eli's feet, hides of elk, dried meat, baskets woven with care, more food than Eli had seen in months. The sisters looked down at him, their expressions solemn but kind. One of them bent slightly, her massive hand brushing the torn edge of his shirt where he had ripped it to bind their wounds. "You gave us life," she said. Her English was broken, but the meaning was clear. "We give you strength." Eli felt a lump in his throat. He had lived years scraping by, ignored by the world, a poor man whose ranch barely clung to the edges of survival. Now here he stood, being offered gifts that could sustain him for months, maybe longer. But it wasn't the food or the hides that shook him. It was the promise that came with them. The chief raised his voice so that every warrior could hear. "From this day forward, the land of Eli Turner is Apache land. Any who come against him come against us. His cattle, his water, his home under our protection. So I speak, so it is." The warriors murmured in unison, a sound that carried the weight of an oath. Eli's heart pounded in his chest. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. Protection from the Apache was no small thing. Out here, settlers whispered of raids and bloodshed, of tribes that defended their land with unyielding ferocity, and now that same ferocity was being promised to him. He struggled to find his words. "Why me?" he asked softly, almost to himself. The chief heard him. "Because the desert watches," he said. "The spirits see the heart of a man when no other eyes are upon him. You were tested, you were seen, and now you are chosen." Eli stood there, stunned, as the chief wrapped the weapons again and placed the bundle in his hands. It was heavier than it looked, not just in weight but in meaning. He felt the eyes of the warriors on him, the eyes of the sisters, the eyes of the chief himself. For the first time in his life, Eli Turner felt like more than a forgotten rancher scratching at the dirt. He felt like a man with purpose tied to something greater than himself. The chief leaned closer, his voice dropping low. But remember this, rancher, gifts are not without cost. My people will protect you, but in turn you must honor us. Do not raise hand or word against us. Do not betray what has been given. If you do, his voice trailed off, but the threat in his eyes was sharper than any blade. Eli nodded quickly. I won't, I swear it. The chief straightened, satisfied. He turned to his daughters, speaking in their language. They responded, their deep voices rolling like thunder. Then, with a wave of his hand, the warriors began to wheel their horses around, the circle breaking apart. Dust rose once more as they prepared to depart, but before they left, one of the sisters stepped close to Eli. She leaned down, her shadow enveloping him, and said softly, You saved us once. Now we save you. Forever. Her words lingered in the air as she straightened and followed the others. Eli stood frozen as the war party rode away, the thunder of hooves fading into the horizon. His ranch was quiet again, but it did not feel the same. The hides and food lay at his feet, the weapons heavy in his arms, and the promise of protection hung in the air like a banner unseen. He looked down at the bundle, then out at the empty land stretching in every direction. For years he had felt small, forgotten, a man living on borrowed time. Now he was bound to a people he barely understood, given gifts he could never repay, tied to a fate he could not yet see. The desert wind picked up, stirring the dust around him, and Eli Turner realized that his life, once measured by hunger and debt, had been rewritten in a single moment. He was no longer just a poor rancher. He was a man claimed by giants, guarded by warriors, and watched by a chief whose judgment carried the weight of mountains. And though he could not yet grasp what it meant, one truth was certain: the world would never look at him the same again. Night fell over the desert like a velvet cloak, stars cutting sharp against the black sky. Eli Turner sat beside a small campfire in the yard of his ranch, the flames licking upward, shadows stretching long across the hard-packed earth. The gifts of the Apache lay near him, hides folded neatly, baskets of food stacked higher than he'd ever thought possible, and the bundle of weapons resting against a post as though daring him to touch them again. His cattle lowed softly in the distance, their silhouettes drifting in and out of the firelight. The world looked the same as it had yesterday, and yet Eli felt as though he were living in a different skin. He stared into the fire, replaying the day in his mind. The chief's words still echoed in his chest, deep and heavy. From this day forward, the land of Eli Turner is Apache land. Those words had changed everything. He wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or terrified. The protection of the Apache was a gift few men could dream of, yet it was also a bond, a tether that tied his life to theirs. Eli had never belonged to much of anything before, and the thought of belonging now, belonging to a people he barely understood, was as frightening as it was humbling. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest sound. Step, heavy, deliberate. Eli reached for his rifle, then froze. Out of the darkness, two immense forms emerged, their shadows towering against the fire's glow. The giant sisters stepped into the light, their faces calm, their eyes reflecting the flames like polished stone. Eli lowered the rifle slowly, though his heart still hammered. Didn't figure I'd see you again so soon, he said, his voice rough. One of the sisters smiled faintly, her lips curling in a way that softened the severity of her sighs. We said we would watch, she replied. Her English was careful, halting but strong. The other sister lowered herself to the ground beside the fire, the earth groaning faintly beneath her weight. She gazed at him for a long moment, her eyes unreadable. You gave us breath again, she said. Now you never sit alone. Eli let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. I've been alone a long time, he admitted. Didn't think that was ever going to change. The sisters exchanged a glance, speaking briefly in their own tongue, the words deep and resonant like stones rolling through a canyon. Then one turned back to him. Alone no more. The fire crackled, sending sparks upward into the star-swept sky. Eli sat with them in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, the rustle of dry grass, the distant cry of a coyote, the steady rhythm of the cattle breathing nearby. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the smallest thing in the desert. With the sisters beside him, their shadows stretching enormous across the ground, he felt anchored, protected. But as the minutes passed, unease crept into his chest. Protection was a gift, yes, but it was also a responsibility. He thought of the chief's warning, the way his voice had turned sharp when he spoke of betrayal. Eli knew enough about life to understand that nothing came without cost. He cleared his throat. Your father, he said I was bound to your people now. That true? The sisters nodded in unison, their movements slow, deliberate. Bound, one said. Like blood. Eli rubbed a hand across his jaw, the stubble scratching against his palm. And what happens if I don't live up to it? For a moment, neither spoke. Then the taller one leaned in closer, her shadow falling heavy over him. Then the desert takes back what it gave. The words chilled him, though her tone carried no malice, only truth. Eli nodded slowly. Reckon I'll just have to make sure I don't let you down then. The sisters both smiled, and in that moment the heaviness lifted just a little. Hours passed. They sat together, the fire dwindling, the moon climbing higher. Eli spoke of his father, of the hardships of the ranch, of the years spent scraping by while the world forgot him. The sisters listened without interruption, their great heads tilted slightly as though every word mattered. In turn, they spoke of their childhood among the mountains, of being born larger than the rest, of the way other tribes whispered of them as though they were more legend than flesh. They spoke of battles fought, of storms weathered, of the loneliness of being set apart even among their own. Eli realized then that despite their size, despite their strength, they knew something of the same loneliness he did. They had walked through life marked as different, carrying burdens others could not understand. That knowledge knit them together in silence more powerful than any words. As dawn began to creep across the horizon, one of the sisters rose, towering against the pale light. She placed her massive hand gently on Eli's shoulder, careful and deliberate. You saved us once, Eli Turner. Now we save you always. The other sister rose as well, her voice deep as thunder. When danger comes, we come. When enemies rise, we rise higher. Eli swallowed hard, looking up at them both. His voice cracked when he spoke. Don't know what I did to deserve it, but thank you. The sisters exchanged another look, then turned and walked into the desert, their enormous silhouettes fading into the early light until they disappeared over the ridge. Eli stood there long after they were gone. The fire burned to ash at his feet, the sun warming the dust beneath his boots. For years he had thought himself cursed with smallness, a man too poor to matter, too alone to be remembered. Now he carried the weight of giants' gratitude, the shield of a chief's promise, and the strength of a people who had claimed him as their own. The land was still harsh, the debt still waiting, the cattle still restless, but Eli no longer felt like a man scraping at the edge of survival. He felt like a man standing at the heart of something vast, something greater than himself, and in that moment, as the desert wind swept across his ranch and the first light of morning spilled across the land, Eli knew the truth. He was no longer alone. He had gained a family bigger than any dream, and with them a destiny no man could steal.